I had been holding my phone in my lap for 45 minutes by the time my father stood up. It was a Saturday evening in late May, and the backyard of my parents' house in Columbus smelled like charcoal and cut grass, and the specific kind of dread I had been carrying in my chest since I was approximately 9 years old. String lights had been strung between the fence posts and the old oak tree my brother Daniel used to climb as a kid, and someone, my mother, I was almost certain, had set out 47 white folding chairs in rough, uneven rows across the lawn. There was a long catering table covered in white cloth with trays of stuffed mushrooms and sliced meats and a bowl of pasta salad that had been sitting in the sun slightly too long. There was a cake from the Italian bakery on Broad Street. My name was written across the top in pale blue icing. I remember looking at the cake and thinking, well, at least the bakery got it right. My father stood at the small folding table they had positioned as a makeshift podium at the far end of the yard, near the rose bushes my mother had planted the year I turned 12. He tapped his glass with a butter knife. The conversations around me died down in the slow, uneven way that 47 separate conversations always die down when someone asks for attention, one cluster at a time, until the whole yard was quiet and all of it was pointed at him. I was 23 years old. I had just finished my degree in structural engineering at Ohio State, graduating with a 3.91 GPA, an internship offer already signed with Heaton and Associates in Cincinnati, and a senior thesis that my faculty advisor, Dr. Marsh, had formally submitted for the department's annual prize in applied design. I had done all of that while working 22 hours a week at a small drafting firm on High Street, paying my own rent and utilities since the fall of my sophomore year, and calling home every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock whether anyone called me back or not. Most Sundays they did not call back. I knew what was in my phone. I had written the sentence 6 weeks earlier. I had read it out loud to my therapist, Dr. Andrea Bloom, in her small office on Broadview Road, sitting in the green velvet armchair beside the window where the afternoon light came in sideways across the floor. She had listened the whole way through without saying a word, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very simply, "That's it. That's the one." I had saved it in a note on my phone, title party. I had looked at it probably 60 times between that Tuesday afternoon and this Saturday evening. I told myself on the drive over that I was not going to use it. I told myself I was going to sit in that yard and smile and eat pasta salad and let my father be whoever he needed to be in front of the neighbors, because that was what I had always done, and I was good at it by now. I told myself I had a real life beginning in Cincinnati in 8 weeks. I told myself it didn't matter anymore what happened at this party, because I was leaving anyway, and the distance would do the work the years hadn't. My father cleared his throat and began to speak. I should tell you about Rosalind Fairhaven because understanding what happened that evening requires understanding what kind of man he is. Not in a simple way, not in a villain way, but in the specific, complicated way that a person who has shaped your life requires understanding. My father is 61 years old. He grew up in a house in Youngstown where the rule, spoken or not, was that men who showed emotion were men who had failed at something. His own father worked at a steel plant and came home tired and ate dinner without speaking and went to bed at 9 o'clock every night for 30 years, and my father watched that and decided he was going to be warmer than that, more present, more involved. And he was, in his way. He coached Daniel's Little League team for 4 years. He drove Daniel to remediation sessions twice a week for 2 years in middle school, when reading wasn't coming together. He stayed up late at the kitchen table going over algebra homework, patient in a way I genuinely admired even as a child. He showed up for Daniel in the specific, practical, visible ways that make a father feel like a father. The problem was not that he loved Daniel. The problem was what he needed from it. My father built his entire sense of himself around being the man Daniel needed. The rescuer. The essential presence. When Daniel struggled, my father had a role. When Daniel triumphed, my father had a story. The Little League Championship in 1998. The day Daniel passed his driving test after 3 attempts. The logistics job in Dayton that Daniel landed through a connection my father had quietly arranged. These were the stories my father told about himself by telling them about Daniel, and those stories organized him and gave him a shape he recognized. I did not struggle the way Daniel did. Reading came early and came easy. Math made a structural kind of sense to me from the time I was in 3rd grade. I worked quietly, and I figured things out, and I did not ask for help I had learned not to expect, and I think my father, genuinely, without malice, filed that away as, "Rosalind is fine. Rosalind doesn't need me." I think he told himself that story because the alternative was harder to look at directly. The alternative was that his attention had been so thoroughly organized around Daniel that I had simply never been in its center. That his love was real, but his awareness was narrow, and I had been standing at the edge of it my whole life, just slightly out of frame. I had been working on understanding this for 2 years, since I started seeing Dr. Bloom at the beginning of my junior year. I had gone in the first time because I was not sleeping and I had started avoiding my Sunday calls home, and I couldn't explain either of those things in a way that made sense. Dr. Bloom had been patient in a way that felt different from other patients I had encountered. She did not rush me toward a conclusion. She let me circle around the same material week after week until one Tuesday afternoon in November, about 4 months in, she said quietly, "It sounds like you've been raising yourself alongside a family that called itself close." That sentence sat in me for a long time. I didn't write it down. I didn't need to. It was already in me before she said it. She had just given it a form I could hold. She also helped me understand something else, something I have held on to more carefully. My father's distance was not a verdict on me. His inability to see me fully was a limitation inside him, not an accurate measurement of my worth. He was afraid, in the way that men of his particular formation are afraid, that if he looked directly at what he had not given me, the story he had built about himself as a good father would require rebuilding. And rebuilding that story meant admitting to a failure he didn't have the tools to absorb.
So he looked away. He looked at Daniel.
He looked at the Little League trophy and the logistics job and the easy wins that confirmed what he needed to believe about himself. Understanding all of that did not make it hurt less, but it changed what I was going to do about it. The first moment I understood, with clarity and language, what had been happening, not just felt it as a shapeless ache but named it precisely, was the Thanksgiving before my senior year. We were all at the dinner table, the 4 of us plus my Aunt Carol and her husband Ray, and my father gave a toast before the meal. He talked about Daniel's new logistics position in Dayton. He talked about my mother's garden, which had received some informal neighborhood recognition that summer. He talked about the Cleveland Browns for approximately 3 minutes because he always does, because that is the register of feeling he reaches for most easily. I sat at that table for 18 full minutes with my hands folded in my lap, waiting for my name. Waiting for any acknowledgement that I was present, that I was a person at the table, that I had a 3.89 GPA and a merit scholarship that had just covered my entire final semester's tuition and a thesis topic I had been developing for 2 years. He never said my name. Not once. My mother caught my eye from across the table. She gave me the look she had been giving me my entire life, a small tilt of the head, apologetic and resigned, the expression of a woman who sees exactly what is happening and has decided, years ago, that she does not have the means to change it. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood at the sink with the water running for 4 minutes. When I looked in the mirror, I made a decision I wasn't fully conscious of making yet. I was going to stop waiting. I was going to do something. I just did not yet know what. Driving home from Thanksgiving on Route 315, I called my friend Petra. Petra and I had been close since the first week of freshman year, when we had both wandered into the wrong department reception and stayed anyway because the food was substantially better than anything in the dining hall. She knew more about my family than almost anyone, because she had been patient enough to ask and to keep asking. "He did it again," I said. "The toast thing?" 18 minutes. I counted. She was quiet for a moment. "Rose," she said finally, "at some point you're going to have to decide what you want to do with this. Because it is not going to change on its own. He is not going to wake up one day and suddenly understand what he's been doing." "I know," I said. "So, what do you want to do?" I drove for about 2 miles in the dark before I answered. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out." The graduation party had been entirely my mother's idea. She had been planning it since February, calling me every 2 or 3 weeks to discuss the details, and I could hear in her voice how much she wanted it to go well. How much she needed this one occasion to be something uncomplicated and warm. She had found the caterer through her coworker Denise, a woman she had worked alongside at the county records office for 11 years, who had used the same company for a retirement party the previous fall. She had ordered the cake 3 weeks in advance and called me twice to confirm the spelling of my name and the flavor. She had strung the lights herself the afternoon before the party, standing on the wooden step stool my father held steady from below, and she had called me that night to say the backyard looked beautiful. I had said yes to everything she proposed, because I loved my mother, and I could see what she was trying to do. She was trying to make this one evening be the thing she had never quite managed to make our family be, a place where I was seen. She was doing it through catered trays and string lights and a cake with my name on it, because those were the tools she had, and I was not going to make that smaller than it was. I did not tell her about the note in my phone. I did not want to put that weight on her before the evening had happened. I arrived at noon to help set up. I unfolded 47 chairs. I helped arrange the serving table and moved the pasta salad into the shade. I walked through the backyard while it was still empty and stood for a moment near the old oak tree, and I thought about being 8 years old, climbing that tree every afternoon in the summer, calling down to my mother in the kitchen window, and my mother looking up and waving. I thought about how simple that had felt. I thought about how much time I had spent since then trying to get back to something that simple. Then I went inside and helped carry ice from the garage freezer, and the first guests began to arrive at 3. By 5 o'clock the yard was filling. My Aunt Carol arrived with her husband Ray and found me immediately, hugging me and saying she was so proud that she had been telling everyone she knew that her niece was going to be an engineer. I held on to that for a moment. My mother's coworker Denise arrived with her teenage son, who was on his phone within 4 minutes of entering the yard and stayed that way, which I found oddly relaxing. Neighbors arrived. Family friends I hadn't seen in several years arrived. People who knew me only as a child and looked at me now with the slightly startled expression of adults encountering the grown version of someone they had stopped tracking. Daniel arrived with Amber at 5:45. Amber was tall and warm and had the particular quality that genuinely kind people have when they walk into a complicated family system. She was trying to be good to everyone simultaneously and couldn't quite understand why the room felt the way it did. She hugged me and said congratulations and seemed to mean every word of it. I liked her. I had liked her the 2 times I had met her before this, and I liked her more for the fact that she had chosen Daniel without appearing to understand, at least not yet, what she had walked into. Daniel and I are not close. We never have been, not in the easy sibling way. The dynamics of our family made closeness complicated. When one child is the center of a family's attention and the other is not, the relationship between the children gets strange, even when neither of them chose those roles. Daniel had never been unkind to me. He had also never really seen me in the way our father hadn't, and I had always suspected it was because seeing me clearly would have required him to look at a version of our family that was harder to live inside of. I watched my father arrive home at 5:47 p.m. from picking up extra napkins. He kissed my mother, shook hands with 2 neighbors, and moved immediately toward Daniel and Amber's corner of the yard. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder. He laughed at something Daniel said. He looked comfortable and warm and recognizable as a man who knew his place in a room. I was standing on the opposite side of the yard, holding a sparkling water. I watched this for a moment. I felt the thing I have felt my whole life, not anger, not even quite sadness in the sharp sense, but something heavier and more specific, like standing outside on a cold night looking through a lit window into a room where everyone inside seems to know exactly why they are there and where you're meant to be. I went to my chair. I sat down. I put the phone in my lap. I opened the note. I still had not decided anything. 9 days before the party, I had been sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Kroger on Henderson Road at 11:22 at night. I had driven there to buy Earl Grey tea. I had been sitting in the parking lot for 31 minutes, without going in. The phone was in my hand. The note was open. I had memorized the sentence 6 weeks ago, but I kept reading it anyway, the way you read something when you need it to remain real and not dissolve into abstraction the way that words can when you look at them too long. I was frightened. I want to say that plainly because I think the way stories like this get told can sometimes sand down the fear, leave it out, make the person who eventually did the thing seem like someone who had always been certain. I was not certain. I was 23 years old, sitting alone in a Honda Civic in a grocery store parking lot at 11 at night, and I was afraid of a long, specific list of things. I was afraid of the silence in the yard. I was afraid of my father's face in the moment after the sentence. Not the anger of it, but the confusion of it. The look of a man encountering something that has no place in the story he has been telling himself. I was afraid of my mother's expression, the one I had been reading and absorbing and trying to survive since childhood. I was afraid that I would say the sentence and walk out and sit in my car and call Petra and feel exactly as invisible as I had always felt, but now also alone in a new way. Afraid that even the truth, stated plainly in front of 47 witnesses, would simply be absorbed and reframed, and I would still be the dramatic one, the difficult one, the one who couldn't just let things be. Dr. Bloom had said something the previous Tuesday that I kept turning over. She had said, "Rosalind, you have been waiting for him to hand you something he genuinely doesn't know he owes. The sentence isn't going to change him. Don't go in expecting it to. Go in because you need a record. Because you need to know that you stood in that yard and said what was true for yourself, regardless of what he does with it." I said that out loud in the car. Alone with the engine off, the windows beginning to fog from the cold, my breath visible in the air in front of me. I said it twice, slowly. Then I put the phone in my bag, and I went into the Kroger. I bought the Earl Grey tea in the tin with the small dent on the lid, the same brand I had bought every week for 2 years, the dent always in the same spot, something reliable and consistent in a life that was about to tip. I drove home. I heated the kettle. I sat at my small kitchen table with the mug between both hands and the leather appointment book open in front of me to the page where I had written the party date, and I thought about everything. I thought about the 18 minutes at Thanksgiving. I thought about all the Thanksgivings before that, the ones where I had sat at the table and waited and counted and looked at my mother's apologetic tilt and gone home and not said anything to anyone. I thought about the merit scholarship I had won and never mentioned to my parents because I had learned somewhere along the way that there was no audience for it. I thought about every Sunday call that went to voicemail. Every achievement that existed only in my own record of it, the small handwritten ledger in my kitchen drawer where I had started, 2 years ago, writing down the things I had done just so they existed somewhere outside my own head. I thought, I have worked too hard and too quietly for too long to sit in that yard on the day I graduated from a degree I built entirely by myself and be invisible one more time. That was not resolution. It was not bravery. It was the truth finally deciding it was done being patient. The morning of the party, Petra called at 9. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay." "Are you actually okay? Or are you doing the thing where you say okay and mean something that takes 20 minutes to explain properly?" I was standing in my kitchen in the blue oversized sweater I had slept in, holding the Earl Grey tin. "I have the note," I said. "I'm going to the party, and I have the note. You're not going to lose your nerve in the parking lot." "I'm not going to lose my nerve. Because I know you, Rose, and you have a tendency to." "I'm not going to lose my nerve," I said again. "I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks. I've been thinking about it for longer than 6 weeks, honestly. I'm going." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'll be on your steps with wine when you get back." "White." "Obviously white," I said. I put on the pale green dress. I put in my grandmother's pearl earrings, the small simple ones I usually put back in the dish before family events because something always happened to the evening before it seemed to deserve them. That afternoon I kept them in deliberately. I was going to be fully there. Whatever happened, I was going to have shown up as myself. I drove to my parents' house. I unfolded chairs. I moved pasta salad into shade. I talked to my Aunt Carol about her raised garden beds for 20 minutes and genuinely enjoyed it. I helped carry ice. I watched 47 people fill the yard and find their corners. I watched my father come home and move toward Daniel, and I felt the familiar weight of it, and I sat down in my chair, and I opened the note, and I waited. My father tapped his glass at 7:18 p.m. He spoke for 12 minutes and 40 seconds. I watched the clock on my phone while he spoke. 12 minutes and 40 seconds, and I gave every second of it a chance. He talked about the value of education, the principle of it, abstract, untethered to any particular person in the yard. He told the story about Daniel's Little League championship in 1998, which I have heard approximately 40 times in my life, and which has nothing to do with a structural engineering degree. He talked about my mother. He thanked the neighbors. He recommended the stuffed mushrooms. He mentioned how long he and my mother had been going to that catering company. He raised his glass and said, "To family." He did not say my name. Not at the beginning. Not in the middle. Not at the end. Not in 12 minutes and 40 seconds at a party where my name was written in pale blue icing on a cake 6 feet away from him. Around me, 47 people raised their glasses. My mother's face was doing the complicated thing it does. Daniel was looking at the grass. Amber was looking at me with her open, helpless, sorry expression. My Aunt Carol, 2 rows back, was very still. I looked down at the note. I sat still for 30 seconds. I know it was 30 seconds because I counted them, one at a time, the way I have always counted the minutes I was waiting to be seen. Some things you prepare, and when the moment comes they feel rehearsed, stiff and mechanical, like watching yourself from outside. This was the opposite of that. When I stood up, it was the most natural movement I had made in years. Something that had been coiled for a long time finally, quietly, came undone. I was not shaking. I was not rushing. I walked to the folding table at the far end of the yard, past the second and first rows of chairs, past my Aunt Carol who said nothing but watched with something in her face I couldn't entirely read. My father was still at the table, reaching for his plate, and he looked at me with a mix of surprise and mild irritation he reserved for deviations from his plan. "Rose," he said. "I have one correction to make," I said. The yard went quiet. Not gradually this time. All at once, the way a room can go quiet when something in the air changes, and everyone registers it simultaneously, without knowing exactly what they are registering. I held up my phone. I looked at the note. I did not look at my father's face while I read, because I did not need to. The sentence was not for him. In 12 years of engineering school and work, I maintained a 3.91 GPA, earned my own tuition, paid my own rent, and received a department prize nomination. And tonight my father gave a 12-minute speech at my graduation party, and did not say my name. I set the phone down on the folding table. I looked at my father then. He was very still. His face had an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not the irritation I expected, but something closer to a man who has encountered something his prepared version of himself has no response for. I said, "Congratulations to everyone." I picked up my bag from my seat. I put on my navy wool coat, the one with the missing third button I had been meaning to replace since March, and somehow always forgotten. I walked through the yard, toward the side gate. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at Daniel. I walked to my car, which was parked on the street 2 houses down, and I got in and I started the engine and I drove away. What my father did not know, what no one in that yard knew except Petra, was that 6 days before the party I had sat in Dr. Bloom's office and recorded myself reading that sentence aloud on my phone. Clearly, steadily, in my own voice. I had emailed the recording to every family email address I had, my father, my mother, Daniel, my Aunt Carol, 2 cousins who had been at the party. The subject line read, "Something I want you to have on record." I had used a delayed send tool to schedule it to go out at 8 p.m. that Saturday evening. It sent at 8 p.m. I was on Route 315 heading north. The first call from my father came in at 8:03. By midnight, I had 11 missed calls from his number. I counted every one. Petra was on my apartment steps with a bottle of Riesling and 2 glasses, exactly as she had said she would be. We sat on the concrete steps in the warm dark and she poured, and I told her everything, slowly, from the beginning of the evening to the drive home. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued most about her. She understands that some stories need to be told the whole way before they can be discussed. "How do you feel?" she said when I finished. I thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "Honest," I said. "Like something that belonged to me has been returned." She nodded and poured more wine, and we sat there for a long time, not talking, listening to a neighbor's television through an open window down the street. It was one of the better hours of the entire year. 11 missed calls from my father sat on my phone. 4 from my mother. 2 from Daniel, which I had not expected. I found out 3 days later, when Amber texted me, that Daniel had left the party about 20 minutes after I did. Amber said she and Daniel had driven home mostly in silence, and that somewhere on 270 he had said, quietly, looking straight ahead at the road. She was right. I've known she was right about all of it for a long time. Amber said she was sorry she hadn't found a way to say something sooner. I wrote back and told her she didn't owe me an apology. I meant it. I did not call anyone back that night. My mother called at 7:49 the next morning. I answered because I have always answered my mother, even when I knew the conversation was going to be hard. She was not angry. My mother exhausted her anger years ago, rerouted it somewhere she no longer has regular access to. She was sad in the quiet, practiced way she is sad, the way of a woman who has been absorbing and smoothing the emotional weather of a family for so long that she no longer experiences the weather directly, only the effect of it on everyone else. Rosalind, she said, you humiliated your father in front of everyone who was there. Mom, I said, I read one true sentence at my own graduation party. You made a scene. I walked to a microphone and read one sentence, and then I left. That was the scene. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he's very hurt. I know he is, I said. I'm sorry it hurts him. I genuinely am. But I needed there to be a record. I needed the people who were in that yard to know what was true. She asked if I would call him and apologize. I said I would call him in time, when I was ready, and that I loved her, and I had to get ready for work. She said okay in the way that contains several things at once, acceptance and resignation, and a grief she cannot name, because naming it would require her to look directly at something she has been choosing not to look at for 20 years. I heated the kettle. I stood at the counter with a copper kettle behind me starting to whistle, and I listened to my father's voicemail, which was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. He said I had embarrassed the family. He said it was dramatic and inappropriate. He said he was certain he had mentioned me in the speech. He was absolutely certain, and that I must have misheard or been listening for the wrong thing. He said he couldn't believe I would do something like that in front of all those people, at an event my mother had worked so hard to put together for me. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he had forgotten my name. I listened to the voicemail once. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and let the kettle finish. My Aunt Carol called 10 days after the party. She is my father's older sister by 4 years, and she is one of the few people in his life who has ever said something to him that landed. She said she had listened to the recording twice. She said, choosing her words with care, that she had been aware for a while that things in our family were not as balanced as they appeared from the outside. She said she had always found me remarkable, my focus, my independence, the way I had moved through school, and she was sorry she had not found a way to say that to me more directly and more often over the years. I thanked her. I meant every word of it. She did not ask me to apologize to my father or to smooth things over or to think about how this was affecting him. She just said she was glad I was doing well and that I could call her anytime. I wrote her name in the small handwritten ledger in my kitchen drawer, in the column I had started using for people who had surprised me by showing up. 3 weeks after the party, my father called in the evening, and I answered. We talked for 22 minutes. He did not fully acknowledge what had happened. I had not expected him to, not in any complete way, because the version of himself he has built over 61 years does not have easy architecture for that kind of direct accounting. But at one point in the conversation, unprompted, after a long pause, he said, I know I'm not always good at showing both of you the same. 12 words. I wrote them down in the ledger when we hung up. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was 12 words he had never said in my presence before, and I held on to them not because they fixed anything but because they were real, and real was more than I had expected. I moved to Cincinnati 6 weeks after the party. The apartment I found has a second bedroom I have turned into a drafting studio, with a long table under an east-facing window that catches the morning light by 6:30. I have the pearl earrings in a small ceramic dish on the bathroom shelf. I wear them more regularly now. I have the Earl Grey tin in the cabinet above the kettle. The dent is still there. Some things you just carry with you and stop minding. The firm is good. I am assigned to a bridge rehabilitation project on a span over the Scioto River, which is exactly the kind of applied structural work I studied for and wanted. My supervisor, Patricia, has been in the field for 27 years and runs her team the way that certain good and competent women run things. Without ceremony, with precision, with a low tolerance for wasted effort. 2 weeks into the job, she mentioned in passing, during a conversation about a drainage recalculation, that she had read my thesis before I arrived, and that she was glad I was there.
She said it the way you say a fact.
Then she kept walking. I thought about that comment for several days. I have had a long time now to think about what happened that evening in my parents' backyard, and I want to tell you what I believe. My father loved me. I want to say that first because it is true, and because leaving it out would make this a simpler story than it is. He loved me in the way that people love what they don't fully see, at a distance, through the shape of a category rather than the specific face of a person. I was the daughter who was fine, the daughter who didn't need. And I think he called that love, and in his version of our story, it was. But there is a difference between loving someone at a safe distance and loving them the way they deserve, closely, specifically, with your eyes open and their name in your mouth. I had been waiting for him to close that distance for 23 years. And I had finally understood, sitting in a green velvet armchair on a Tuesday afternoon in March, that the waiting was something I was choosing, that I could choose differently. That I could say the true thing out loud in a yard full of witnesses and walk to my car and drive home and let the consequences be whatever they were going to be, and that doing so would not be an act of cruelty, but an act of honesty, the first honest thing, maybe, I had ever done in that family without softening it first for everyone else's comfort. Saying the true thing did not make me dramatic. It made me someone with a record. Some people can only recognize what they have missed when it refuses to stay invisible quietly. My father is one of those people, and I cannot change that about him, and I have stopped trying. Real family, the kind that sustains you, the kind worth building a life alongside, does not ask you to disappear inside it in order to prove your loyalty. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Understanding is not reunion. Compassion does not require me to keep standing at the edge of the frame, waiting for someone to move me to the center. Love that asks you to be smaller is not love. It is management. And I had been managed for 23 years, and I was not willing to pay that cost for another 23. The cost of keeping the peace in a room, where peace means being the smallest person in it, is your whole life. I was 23 years old. I had a bridge to rehabilitate. I had a window that caught the morning light. I had Petra on my steps with white wine, and my Aunt Carol in the ledger under people who showed up, and Dr. Bloom in her green velvet armchair, and the pearl earrings in their dish on the bathroom shelf. Family is whoever shows up when there is nothing to gain. I know who mine is now. I think about you if you have listened this far. I think about whether you have a table like that somewhere in your life. An event where the minutes pass and your name goes unsaid, and the person who is supposed to say it looks right through you, and you sit there and count, because counting is the only thing you can do with the feeling. If you have been counting minutes, I want to ask you one thing. What have you been waiting for them to give you? And how long are you willing to keep waiting for something they may not know they owe?